My name is Emma Sanders, and I am 31 years old. And on the day I got married, I stood in a white dress in a hallway outside a ballroom in Charleston, looking at an empty row of chairs reserved for my parents, while a string quartet played a song my mother had specifically requested for the processional, 6 months earlier, before she'd apparently decided that requesting a song and showing up to hear it played were two entirely separate commitments. I want to describe that hallway carefully because I have thought about it more than almost any other physical space in my life since. White wainscoting, the specific, soft afternoon light coming through tall windows that overlook the garden, where 200 guests were already seated. My bridesmaids clustered a few feet away, pretending not to watch me check my phone for the fourth time in 10 minutes. My wedding planner, a calm, efficient woman named Dolores, who had clearly handled every possible crisis a wedding day could produce except, apparently, this exact one, standing slightly behind me with the specific patient stillness of someone waiting for instructions she didn't want to be the one to ask for. It was 11:40 in the morning. The ceremony was scheduled for noon. My parents, who lived 90 minutes away, who had confirmed their attendance 3 separate times across the preceding month, who occupied, on the seating chart I'd spent 6 months perfecting, the two chairs in the absolute front row directly facing the altar, had not arrived, had not called, and had not, as far as I could determine from a flurry of texts to my cousin Lily, who'd offered to drive past their house on her way to the venue, even left their home yet. I called my mother. I want to tell you what I expected when I made that call, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I expected an explanation, a flat tire, a medical scare, some genuine, if frustrating, logistical catastrophe that would at least make sense of an empty row of chairs an hour before her daughter's wedding. She picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear, in the background, the specific ambient noise of a kitchen, a dish being set down, the low murmur of a television. Not a car, not a hospital waiting room, a kitchen at 11:40 in the morning, 90 minutes from where her daughter was standing in a wedding dress with 200 people waiting. "Mom," I said, "where are you guys? The ceremony's in 20 minutes." There was a pause, the specific, irritated pause of someone who has been asked a question they consider unreasonable. "Emma, we're not going to make it on time. Your father's not feeling up to the drive today." I want to be precise about the exact words she said next, because I have replayed them so many times in the months since that I could recite them in my sleep, and I think the precision of cruelty often lives in how casual it sounds. "Don't bother us about it right now," she said. "We'll talk later." And she hung up. I stood in that hallway holding a phone that had just gone silent, in a dress that had taken 4 fittings to get right, listening to a string quartet warming up for a processional my mother had chosen, and I felt something I want to describe as carefully as I can, because I think people expect devastation in this moment, and devastation isn't quite what I felt. What I felt was the specific, clean click of a number finally reconciling, the same sensation I would later realize, that I feel at work when a spreadsheet that hasn't been adding up for weeks suddenly resolves itself, and you understand, all at once, exactly where the error had been hiding the entire time, and exactly how long it had been there. I am a financial analyst. I have spent 8 years reading numbers for a living, finding the places where a story someone tells doesn't match what the actual figures show. And standing in that hallway, I understood, with a clarity that arrived considerably faster than grief did, that I had spent 6 years funding a story about my parents that the actual figures had never supported, and that I had simply never let myself look closely enough to see it. Dolores touched my arm gently. "Emma, do you want a few minutes?" I did not want a few minutes. I want to tell you exactly what I wanted, because I think it's the detail that defines everything that happened over the following hour, and over the following 30 minutes after that, and over the following 6 years that I would spend, in the weeks after my wedding, finally adding up correctly. I took out my phone again. Not to call my mother back. I opened my banking app, the same app I'd used every single month for 6 years, to send a recurring transfer of $2,000 to my parents' checking account. A transfer I had set up on a Tuesday afternoon during what I'd believed at the time was the worst financial crisis of my father's life. and had never once, in 72 consecutive months, paused, questioned, or reconsidered. I navigated to the recurring transfer screen. I found the line item, Mom and Dad, monthly support, exactly as I'd labeled it 6 years earlier. In a font and a format I had looked at so many times, it had become invisible to me. The way anything repeated long enough eventually stops registering as a choice and starts registering as simply how things are. I stood in that hallway, in my wedding dress, with my bridesmaids watching and a string quartet playing, and 200 people waiting in a garden for a ceremony that was now 8 minutes from starting. And I pressed cancel. A confirmation screen appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer? This action cannot be undone. I want to tell you that I hesitated. I didn't. I had been hesitating, in one form or another, for 6 years, explaining away inconsistencies, accepting vague excuses, telling myself that family meant showing up even when the math stopped making sense. And I had run entirely out of hesitation in the specific span of time it took my mother to say, "Don't bother us," and hang up the phone. I pressed confirm. The screen updated. Transfer canceled. This recurring payment is no longer active. I closed the app. I handed my phone to my maid of honor, my college roommate Priya, who had been standing close enough to see exactly what I'd just done and was looking at me with an expression I would spend the rest of that day deeply grateful for. Not shock, not alarm, just a kind of fierce, immediate solidarity. The specific look of someone who has watched you carry something for years and has just watched you set it down. "You good?" she asked quietly. I want to tell you what I said because I meant it more completely than I had meant almost anything in years. "I'm good," I said. "Let's get married." I walked down that aisle 11 minutes later, on my uncle's arm because my father wasn't there to do it, past a front row with 2 empty chairs in it that nobody in that garden, except my closest friends, understood the actual significance of yet, and I smiled the entire way, because the man waiting for me at the end of it was real and solid and present, in the specific, uncomplicated way my parents had stopped being present for longer than I had let myself admit. I did not know, walking down that aisle, exactly how much my parents had built on top of that $2,000 a month across 6 years. I did not know about the cruise. I did not know about my brother's truck, or the kitchen renovation, or the specific, comfortable life that had been quietly constructed on a foundation I had been pouring, automatically, without question, since a Tuesday afternoon 6 years earlier, when my father had called me crying, telling me he'd lost his job, telling me the house was at risk, telling me he didn't know what they were going to do. I would find all of that out within the month. But I want to be honest about something, standing at the very beginning of this story. Some part of me, walking down that aisle in a dress my own money had paid for, already understood that the call I'd just made in that hallway wasn't really about a missed ceremony. It was about every single month, for 6 years, that I had quietly, automatically, without asking a single hard question, funded a story I had never actually verified. And 30 minutes after I said I do, while I was still on the receiving line hugging guests I'd known my whole life, my phone, sitting in Priya's clutch a few feet away, began buzzing with the first of what would become 11 consecutive missed calls from my mother. I didn't look at it once during the reception. I looked at it the next morning, sitting at my kitchen table in my hotel robe, and what I found waiting for me, voicemails, texts, and one message from my younger brother that read, in full, "What the hell did you do?" was the beginning of understanding exactly how much my family had been counting on a transfer they never once thanked me for, and exactly how unprepared they were for the specific, quiet finality of watching it disappear. To understand why I canceled that transfer in 11 minutes flat, in a wedding dress, without a single moment of hesitation, you have to understand the Tuesday afternoon, 6 years earlier, when it started. I was 25. I had been at my first real analyst job for exactly 14 months, still living in a one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, still building the specific, careful financial foundation that anyone starting a career in finance learns to build. An emergency fund, a retirement contribution I increased by 1% every time I got a raise, the unglamorous discipline of someone who had watched enough client portfolios fall apart from a lack of exactly this kind of foundation to take it seriously in my own life. My father called me at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, which was itself unusual because my father almost never called during the workday, and I remember answering with the specific low-grade alarm that an unexpected midday call from a parent always produces. He was crying. I want to describe what that sounded like because I had heard my father cry exactly twice before in my entire life. Once at my grandmother's funeral, and once, briefly, at my college graduation. And the sound of it on that call was different from both of those times. Rawer, less controlled. The specific quality of someone who has been holding something together for longer than they can manage, and has finally run out of strength to keep holding it. He told me he'd lost his job. 22 years at the same logistics company, a mid-level operations management position he'd held since before I was born, and the company had done a restructuring, and he was out, effective immediately, with a severance package that he told me, through what sounded like genuine devastation, wasn't going to cover more than 2 months of expenses. He told me the mortgage was 3 months behind. He told me he hadn't told my mother yet how bad it actually was, because he didn't know how to. He told me he didn't know what they were going to do, and somewhere in the middle of that call, without him ever directly asking, I heard myself say the words that would define the next 6 years of my financial life. "I can help," I said. "Let me set something up, just until you're back on your feet." I want to be honest about what I was actually offering, because I think the specific generosity of that offer and the specific naivety of it both matter for understanding everything that came after. I had, at 25, just enough financial stability to spare $2,000 a month without endangering my own foundation. Not comfortably, but sustainably, the kind of sacrifice that felt at the time like exactly what a daughter should be willing to make for parents who had raised her, fed her, paid for the same college degree that was now letting her be the one who could help. I set up the recurring transfer that same evening, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, choosing the label Mom and Dad, Monthly Support, because it felt accurate and temporary, a placeholder for a situation I genuinely believed at 25 was going to resolve itself within a matter of months. I did not know, setting up that transfer, that my father had not actually lost his job in the way he'd described it to me. I would not learn the actual truth for 6 more years. What I understood at the time, the only thing I had any reason to understand, was that my father was a man I had always known to be steady, reliable, the specific kind of dependable presence that had defined my entire childhood, and that he was crying on the phone telling me he didn't know what he was going to do, and that I had the capacity to make that specific crisis smaller. So I made it smaller, month after month, for 6 years. I want to walk through how those 6 years actually unfolded, because I think the gradual, almost invisible way a temporary arrangement becomes permanent is the part of this story that matters most, more than any single dramatic moment. Month 3, my father texted to say he'd had 2 promising interviews, but neither had panned out yet, and could I keep the transfers going a little longer? I said of course. Month 7, my mother called to thank me, genuinely, warmly, and to mention that my father had decided to take some time to explore his options, rather than rushing back into another corporate logistics role at his age, which struck me, at the time, as reasonable. My father was 58, and the job market for that specific role at that specific seniority level genuinely was difficult. Month 14. The transfers had become, without any explicit conversation establishing it, simply a fixed feature of my monthly budget, the way a subscription you forget you're paying for becomes invisible once it's automated. I had stopped asking, every month, how the job search was going, because asking had started to feel, by then, like pressure I didn't want to put on parents who were clearly struggling, and because the answer, when I did ask, had settled into a kind of vague, unchanging holding pattern. Still looking. A few things in the pipeline. Your father's pride makes this hard for him to talk about. That I had learned, across those first 14 months, not to push too hard against. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's the most important psychological detail in this entire account. There is research in the field of family financial dynamics on what's sometimes called the rescuer pattern, the specific role a family member settles into when they become the person who absorbs financial instability on behalf of others, often because they were, at some point earlier in the family's history, positioned as the capable one, the responsible one, the child whose competence made them the natural answer to a crisis. I didn't know that research existed at 25. I understand it now, looking back, as almost a perfect description of exactly what happened to me. Not because anyone sat me down and assigned me that role explicitly, but because I had been, my entire life, the daughter who got things done, while my younger brother Tyler had been, with equal consistency, the one whose mistakes got quietly absorbed and explained away. Once a crisis appeared, the family's existing architecture simply slotted me into the position it had already built for me years earlier, and I walked into it without ever consciously deciding to. By year 3, the transfers had become so embedded in my financial life that I genuinely stopped thinking of them as a crisis response at all. They were simply a line item, the way rent is a line item, the way my retirement contribution is a line item, present every month, accounted for in my budgeting, no longer attached, in my own mind, to the specific emotional weight of that Tuesday afternoon phone call that had started it. What I didn't examine, across those 3 years, was the math that should have eventually bothered me. $2,000 a month, for 36 months, was $72,000. I knew that number, somewhere in the analytical part of my brain that processes figures professionally every single day. I simply never let that number sit next to the question it should have generated, which was, what exactly is $72,000 actually being used for 6 years into a temporary job search? I didn't ask that question for 3 more years, and the answer, when I finally did ask it, was waiting for me in a place I never expected to find it. A Facebook photo my cousin Lily had tagged me in by accident, 4 weeks before my wedding, showing my parents standing on the deck of a cruise ship, tan and relaxed and visibly happy, with a caption that read, "Caribbean with the Sandersons," and a timestamp from a week my mother had told me, on the phone, they were just trying to get by until the next heating bill. I want to describe the exact moment I saw that photo, because I have gone back to it so many times since that I can recall the precise physical sensation of it. Sitting on my couch on a Wednesday evening, 4 weeks before my wedding, scrolling through wedding-related notifications, when a tagged photo notification appeared from my cousin Lily, a relative I'm close with but don't follow particularly closely, the specific kind of notification that arrives sideways into your life rather than something you went looking for. The photo showed my parents on the deck of what was unmistakably a cruise ship. My father in a pale blue polo shirt I'd never seen before. My mother in sunglasses and a sundress, both of them tan in the specific way you only get from consecutive days of actual sun, rather than a weekend errand. Both of them smiling the wide, relaxed smile of people who are, in that exact moment, having a genuinely good time. The caption, written by my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, read, "So good catching up with the Sandersons on the Caribbean cruise. Long overdue." I sat with that photo for a long time before I did anything with the information in it, because I want to be honest about my own first instinct, which was to find an explanation. I am, by training and by temperament, someone who looks for the alternative reading before accepting the damning one, a professional habit that has served me well in finance, where the first explanation for a discrepancy is often wrong, and a personal habit that had, I would come to understand, served my parents considerably better than it had served me. Maybe it was a gift, I told myself. Maybe my Aunt Carol had paid for the trip, a generous sister treating a struggling couple to a much-needed break. Maybe it was years old, a photo Lily had simply tagged late, a digital archive surfacing at a strange time with no actual bearing on the present. I checked the timestamp on the photo itself, which Facebook still displayed in the corner of the upload. It was from 11 days earlier. I want to describe the specific call I made that same evening, because I think the contrast between how I approached this conversation and how my mother had approached the phone call that ended our relationship on my wedding day matters enormously. I did not call my mother accusatorially. I called my Aunt Carol, gently, the way you ask a question you genuinely want a non-defensive answer to, and asked her how the cruise had come together. "Oh, it was wonderful," Carol said, with the specific warm enthusiasm of someone who has no idea she's about to become a witness in a case she didn't know existed. "Your parents have been talking about doing something like that for years. Your dad finally said, life's short, we should just go for it. They booked it themselves, paid for the whole thing. I think your mom mentioned it was almost $6,000 for the week, which I told her was a steal for that itinerary." I asked, as casually as I could manage, how my dad's job search had been going, since I assumed they must have finally landed something good if they were comfortable spending that kind of money. There was a small pause on Carol's end, the specific pause of someone realizing, mid-sentence, that they might be saying something they shouldn't. "Job search?" she said. "Emma, your dad retired years ago. 3, 4 years now? He took the early retirement package from the logistics company. I thought you knew that." I want to tell you what happened in my chest hearing those words, because I think the physical sensation of it is more honest than any description of shock or betrayal could be. It felt like the specific cold drop of watching a number on a spreadsheet move in a direction you'd been told, repeatedly, by someone you trusted was impossible. My father had not been laid off in a restructuring. My father had taken an early retirement package, voluntary, with a payout, with benefits, sometime around year 3 of my monthly transfers, and had simply continued telling me, and apparently telling everyone else who might have questioned the ongoing need, that he was still searching, still struggling, still one difficult month away from losing the house. I want to describe what I did next because I think it's the part of this story that most directly reflects who I actually am. Underneath the version of myself who had spent 6 years quietly absorbing a story without checking it. I opened my laptop. I am a financial analyst. I have spent 8 years building the specific professional skill of reconstructing a true financial picture out of incomplete and sometimes deliberately misleading data, and I turned that skill, for the first time in my life, directly on my own family. I pulled every text message, every email, every conversation I could find across 6 years where my parents had described their financial situation to me. I built a timeline, the same way I'd build a timeline for any client account I was reviewing for irregularities, cross-referencing what they'd told me against dates, against photos, against the specific public records that, it turns out, are considerably easier to find than most people realize once you know to look for them. What I found, over the following 4 days, working in the evenings after my regular job, was not a single lie. It was a structure. A sustained 6-year architecture of selective honesty, where individual statements were often technically true in isolation. Yes, the mortgage had been behind, in year 1, before my transfers caught it up. Yes, my father had genuinely been job hunting for the first 8 months before he'd quietly accepted the early retirement package and simply never told me the search had ended. But where the cumulative effect across 6 years was a complete and carefully maintained fiction about ongoing financial precarity that bore almost no relationship to the actual, considerably more comfortable life my parents had been living. I found my father's retirement package details through a public pension disclosure database, the kind of resource I use professionally, and had simply never thought to apply to my own family, because applying it would have required a level of suspicion I had never let myself feel toward my own parents. The package included a lump sum payout of just under $200,000, paid out in year 3 of my transfers, along with a reduced but ongoing pension that, combined with my mother's part-time bookkeeping income, gave them a baseline monthly income that, by any reasonable accounting, should have made my $2,000 a month entirely unnecessary. I found the kitchen renovation, charged across several months to a home improvement company 2 towns over, totaling just under $30,000 in year 4. I found my brother Tyler's truck, a nearly new pickup purchased outright, no financing, in year 5, the same year Tyler had told me over a family dinner I'd specifically helped pay for that he was still trying to get back on his feet after a rough patch with his own finances that I had, naturally, also been quietly supplementing on the side, in smaller amounts, whenever he asked. I sat at my kitchen table on the fourth night of this research, 4 weeks before my wedding, with a spreadsheet open that I had built the same way I build every spreadsheet, methodically, completely, with sources documented for every line. And I looked at the total figure at the bottom. Across 6 years, I had transferred my parents $144,000. Across the same 6 years, by the most conservative reconstruction I could build from available records, my parents had received approximately $360,000 in combined retirement payout, ongoing pension income, and my mother's earnings. Money that had gone toward a cruise, a kitchen renovation, a truck for my brother, and a standard of living that I had been led to believe, every single month for 6 years, was barely surviving. I want to describe what I felt looking at that number, because I think the honest answer surprises people who expect rage to be the dominant emotion. What I felt more than anything was a specific, quiet grief. The recognition that the version of my father who had called me crying on a Tuesday afternoon, devastated and afraid, asking for help he genuinely needed, had been real, exactly once, at the very beginning. And that everything after that, every vague update, every careful non-answer, every 6 more years of still looking, had been a performance, sustained not out of malice exactly, but out of the specific, ordinary human comfort of discovering that a crisis you no longer have produces a steady income you'd rather not lose. I closed the laptop that night without deciding what I was going to do with what I'd found. I had a wedding in 4 weeks. I had a dress, a venue, 200 guests, a fiancé who deserved a wife who wasn't consumed, in the final month before their marriage, by a financial reckoning with her own parents. So I did the thing I had apparently been trained my entire life to do exceptionally well. I held it, quietly, completely, without telling anyone except Priya, who I swore to secrecy over a bottle of wine the following weekend, and who looked at me with an expression of fury on my behalf that I genuinely hadn't expected to need, but was deeply grateful to receive. I did not cancel the transfer that night. I did not confront my parents in the 4 weeks leading up to my wedding. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for understanding the specific shape of what happened on my wedding day itself. I was waiting. Not for a perfect moment. I hadn't planned the timing of what eventually happened in that hallway, hadn't anticipated my mother's specific cruelty on the phone, hadn't designed any of it as a calculated reveal. I was waiting, I think, for some small part of me that still wanted to be wrong. Some part of me that hoped, across those 4 weeks, that my parents would show up to my wedding, sit in the front row exactly where I'd planned for them, and prove, through nothing more dramatic than their actual presence, that whatever the spreadsheet said about money, the relationship underneath it was still real. They did not show up. And when my mother told me, an hour before my ceremony, not to bother her about it, the 4 weeks of careful, quiet waiting I'd been doing finally, completely, ran out. I want to back up slightly and tell you about my brother Tyler, because I think understanding the specific shape of the inequality in my family, not just the financial deception, but the decade of pattern that preceded it, matters for understanding why canceling that transfer felt, to me, less like an impulsive act of anger and more like the final correction to a ledger I had been quietly, unconsciously balancing wrong my entire life. Tyler is 28, 3 years younger than me, and I want to be careful in how I describe him, because I don't think Tyler is a villain in this story so much as a beneficiary of a dynamic he never had to examine, the same way I had spent 6 years not examining my own role in it. Tyler has had, across his adult life, a specific and consistent pattern of financial instability. 2 jobs that ended badly, a brief and expensive entanglement with cryptocurrency trading in his early 20s, a car accident in his mid-20s that wasn't his fault, but that he'd been underinsured for, the kind of cumulative bad luck and poor planning that happens to a lot of people in their 20s, and that, in a healthier family system, gets addressed directly, rather than quietly absorbed by whoever happens to be positioned as capable. I had been quietly absorbing Tyler's instability for almost as long as I'd been absorbing my parents'. Smaller amounts, less regular, but present across the same 6-year window. $400 here for a car repair, a $1,100 there for a security deposit on an apartment. Money that always came with the same specific framing, delivered by my mother on Tyler's behalf, more often than by Tyler directly. He's just going through a rough patch. You know how he is. He'll pay you back when things turn around. Things never turned around in a way that produced repayment. I want to be precise about that, because I think the absence of any expectation of repayment is itself the most revealing detail in the entire family structure. Nobody in my family, across 6 years, ever once asked when I expected to be paid back for any of it. Not the $2,000 a month to my parents, not the smaller, irregular amounts to Tyler, because the entire system operated on an unspoken premise that had never been stated aloud and had therefore never been available for anyone to actually question. Emma has it. Emma will help. That is simply how things work in this family. I found, during the same 4 days of research that uncovered the cruise and the retirement package, the actual story of Tyler's truck. And I want to describe it because the specific contrast between how Tyler's needs were treated and how mine had been treated my entire life is, I think, the clearest illustration of the family dynamic that made everything else possible. Tyler's truck had been purchased in year 5 of my transfers, in cash, no financing, meaning someone had handed over roughly $41,000 for it outright. I confirmed this through the dealership's public business registration filings, cross-referenced against a celebratory Facebook post Tyler had made at the time that I'd seen and, at the time, genuinely believed reflected him finally getting his financial life together through his own hard work. A narrative my mother had specifically reinforced to me at a family dinner that same month, telling me how proud she was that Tyler had really turned things around. What I learned, going back through it with the specific forensic patience I use professionally, was that the truck had been a gift, paid for by my parents, out of the same retirement payout that had also funded the kitchen renovation, and was, that same year, allegedly being preserved by my father's continued unemployment as a desperately needed cushion against losing the house. I want to describe what I felt discovering this, because I think it's more layered than simple anger at Tyler, who I don't believe orchestrated any of this deception himself, who I believe, in fact, genuinely had no idea where the truck money had actually come from, versus what our parents' real financial situation was, because nobody had ever shown him a spreadsheet either. What I felt was a specific, cold clarity about the architecture of my entire family. The recognition that I had been cast, from a young age, in a role that had nothing to do with my actual capacity, and everything to do with the family's collective comfort in having someone reliable to lean on, while Tyler had been cast in the complementary role, the one whose struggles were chronic and therefore unremarkable, requiring no real accountability because that's just how Tyler is. There's a specific concept in family systems theory, developed across decades of clinical research into how families distribute roles among siblings, sometimes called the parentified child, the son or daughter who often very early gets positioned as the capable one, the one who takes care of others rather than being taken care of, frequently because doing so earns them a specific, conditional form of approval that becomes, over time, almost impossible to separate from their actual sense of being loved. I had read about this concept exactly once, years earlier, in an article I'd half-skimmed during a slow afternoon at work, and had filed it away as interesting but not personally relevant. Sitting at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet showing $144,000 of my own money funding someone else's comfortable retirement, I understood, with the specific unpleasant clarity of recognizing yourself in a clinical description, exactly how relevant it had always been. I called Tyler 4 days before my wedding, not to confront him, but because I genuinely wanted to understand how much he knew. I want to be honest that I went into that call prepared for him to have known everything, prepared to discover that my entire family had been actively, collectively deceiving me for years. That isn't what I found. Tyler, when I asked him carefully, without revealing the full scope of what I'd discovered about Dad's retirement timeline, seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Dad's retired?" he said. "I mean, yeah, I guess, for a while now. I don't really think about it. Why?" I asked him about the truck, gently, framing it as a question about how the purchase had come together. Mom and Dad helped out, he said, with the specific, easy unconcern of someone who has never once had to ask where help comes from, because help has simply always been available. They said it was a gift, like an early inheritance thing. I didn't really ask questions, honestly. Should I have? I told him not to worry about it. I want to explain why I protected Tyler in that moment from the full weight of what I was discovering, even though some part of me, in the days immediately following, wondered whether that protection was its own continuation of the pattern. The capable sibling once again managing the emotional fallout so the less capable one wouldn't have to. I protected him because I genuinely believed after that call that Tyler hadn't been a co conspirator in the deception. He had simply been a beneficiary of a system our parents had built and maintained, the same way I had been for 6 years, an unwitting funder of it. The difference between us wasn't character, it was role. He had been cast as the one who receives without question. I had been cast as the one who provides without question. Neither of us had built those roles. We had inherited them, the way you inherit anything in a family, without ever being given the chance to evaluate whether the inheritance actually served you. I did not tell Tyler on that call what I'd found about the cruise or the full retirement payout or the precise scale of what our parents had been doing for 6 years. I wanted to see first whether they would show up to my wedding. I wanted, even after everything I'd already discovered, to give them the chance to prove that the relationship underneath the money was still something real. 4 days later, standing in a hallway in a wedding dress, listening to my mother tell me not to bother her, I understood that I had gotten my answer. I want to tell you what I did in the days immediately following my wedding, because I think it matters for understanding that canceling the transfer wasn't an ending. It was the opening move in a reckoning I had been quietly building the evidence for across an entire month, and that my family, who had spent 6 years assuming I would never look closely enough to find any of it, was about to discover exactly how thoroughly I had. I want to return now to the wedding day itself, because I think the way the actual ceremony unfolded, once I'd canceled that transfer and walked down the aisle, matters as much as anything that happened before or after it. I married David at noon, in a garden behind the ballroom, with 200 guests watching, my Uncle Frank walking me down the aisle in my father's place, with the specific gentle awareness of a man who understood, without needing to be told the full story, that something had gone wrong and that his job, in that moment, was simply to be steady. I want to describe what it felt like, standing at that altar, because I think people assume a wedding day marred by this kind of absence must have felt hollow, and it didn't. Not in the way I expected. David knew. I had texted him from that hallway 4 words, "Parents aren't coming, okay?" And he had texted back, in the 90 seconds before he saw me walk down the aisle, 6 words that I have kept a screenshot of since. "I'm here. That's what matters." And when I reached him at the altar, before the officiant even began, he squeezed both my hands and said, quietly, just for me, "Whatever happened, we're getting married today. The rest is just logistics." I want to be honest that the ceremony itself was, despite everything, genuinely beautiful. And I think that's an important detail because I don't want this story to read as though my wedding was ruined. It wasn't. What was ruined, irreparably, was my relationship with my parents. But the marriage itself, the actual commitment I was making to David, was untouched by any of it. And I think that distinction is the thing that allowed me to walk through the rest of that day with the specific steadiness I managed to hold on to. The reception began at 4. I want to describe what those first 30 minutes were actually like, because I think the contrast between the warmth of that room and what was happening, simultaneously, on a phone sitting in my maid of honor's clutch, is the part of this story that I find myself returning to most often. There was a receiving line, the specific choreographed warmth of 200 people filing past to offer congratulations, hugs, the occasional happy tear from an aunt who'd known me since childhood. There was a first dance, David's hand steady at my waist, both of us laughing about something his best man had said in his toast. There was the specific golden light of a Charleston evening in early autumn, string lights coming on overhead as the sun went down, the kind of evening that, in any photograph taken from across the room, looked exactly like what a wedding is supposed to look like. What I didn't see, because I had specifically asked Priya to hold my phone and not tell me anything unless it was an emergency, was the phone itself, buzzing with increasing frequency in her clutch, sitting on a chair near the head table. Priya told me the next morning exactly what had happened on that phone across those 30 minutes, because she had watched it happen in real time, glancing down periodically with the specific morbid fascination of someone watching a situation unfold that she has no power to influence and isn't sure she wants to. The first call came at 12:30, 18 minutes after the canceled transfer notification would have hit my parents' bank. Not from my mother, but from my father, a man who had not called me directly, on his own initiative, more than perhaps a dozen times across the entire previous year. It went to voicemail. He called again 4 minutes later. Voicemail again. The first text arrived at 12:41 from my mother. "Emma, call me right now." Priya described the messages that followed across the next 20 minutes with a kind of clinical precision I was grateful for later, because it meant I got an accurate accounting rather than a softened one. The tone of the text shifted, she said, in a way that told its own story about what my parents had actually been thinking during that escalation, moving from confusion to irritation to something closer to genuine panic, in a progression that mapped almost exactly onto the realization, happening in real time on their end, of exactly how much they had been depending on money they'd spent 6 years insisting they barely needed. "Did something happen with the bank transfer? There's an error, Emma. This isn't funny. Call me back. Your father needs his medication refilled this week, and we were counting on this. Please call." I want to pause on that last message because I think it's worth examining honestly, the way I examined it myself, sitting in my hotel room the next morning, reading through everything Priya had screenshotted on my behalf. My father's medication needs were real. He does take maintenance medications, the ordinary kind a man in his 60s takes for blood pressure and cholesterol, and the cost of those medications is genuinely not trivial. But the specific deployment of that detail, in that exact moment, as the first concrete justification offered for why the money needed to keep flowing, told me something about the instinctive shape of my parents' thinking that the cruise photo and the retirement records had already told me in slower, more documented form. The crisis was real enough to invoke. It simply hadn't been the actual cause of 6 years of dependency. It was, instead, the specific kind of detail you reach for when you need a sympathetic, unimpeachable reason that will make the person you're appealing to feel guilty for questioning anything further. The calls and texts continued through the dinner service. By the time the cake was cut, around 6:30, my mother had called 11 times and sent 14 text messages, the content of which had moved, Priya told me, from panic into something closer to anger. The specific anger of someone who has been denied access to a resource they had stopped consciously experiencing as a favor and had started, somewhere across 6 years, experiencing as an entitlement. "This is incredibly selfish on your wedding day of all days. We are still your parents. Emma, this is how you treat family." I want to sit with that second message for a moment, because I think it's the most revealing single sentence in this entire account, and because I didn't fully understand its weight until weeks later, after I'd had time to think about it alongside everything else I'd discovered. This is how you treat family. Not an acknowledgement of the missed ceremony, not an explanation for why they hadn't come. A direct accusation, delivered while I was at my own reception, that canceling a transfer of money I had voluntarily given for 6 years constituted a betrayal of family loyalty, as though the obligation ran only in one direction, as though showing up to your daughter's wedding was negotiable in a way that her monthly financial support to you was not. By the time David and I left the reception that night, around 11, riding to our hotel in the back of a car decorated by our friends with the specific chaotic enthusiasm of people who'd had several glasses of champagne, my mother had called 14 times in total. My father had called twice more. Tyler had sent the single message I'd seen referenced before I went to sleep that night, the one that would be waiting for me along with everything else the next morning. What the hell did you do? I did not respond to any of it that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think the choice to wait, rather than the choice to cancel the transfer itself, is actually the part of this story that required the most discipline. I wanted, more than anything in those first hours of my marriage, to simply be married, to sit in a hotel room with David, order room service we were too tired to really eat, and exist, for one night, entirely outside the gravitational pull of a family crisis I had spent 6 years quietly managing. David asked me, around midnight, lying in the dark of that hotel room, whether I was okay. I'm okay, I said, and I meant it the same way I'd meant it standing in that hallway 11 hours earlier. I think I've been waiting a long time to find out what would happen if I just stopped. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about often since, because I think it captured, more precisely than I could have at the time, exactly what had happened. It sounds like you didn't do anything today, he said. It sounds like you finally just let them see what was already true. I fell asleep around 1 in the morning, my phone still off in Priya's bag in the next room. 11 missed calls and a dozen unread texts waiting patiently for a morning I wasn't in any hurry to reach. I want to describe the morning after my wedding carefully, because it was the first time, in 6 years, that I had ever sat down and actually faced my family's reaction to a boundary, rather than quietly absorbing whatever discomfort the conversation produced and moving forward anyway. I woke up around 8 in the hotel room David and I had booked for our wedding night, with the specific soft disorientation of a morning that should have felt entirely celebratory, and instead carried a low, persistent undertone of dread I hadn't fully processed the night before. David was already awake, sitting up against the headboard with his laptop open, doing the specific kind, unobtrusive thing he does when he wants to give me space without leaving the room. Being present, working quietly, available the moment I wanted to talk. I retrieved my phone from Priya's bag, which she'd left outside our door that morning, along with a note that read, in her handwriting, I screenshotted everything so you don't have to scroll through 11 missed calls on your wedding morning. Love you. Drink water. I sat at the small table by the window, still in my hotel robe, and I read through what she'd compiled, the same texts I described in the previous chapter, laid out in chronological order with timestamps. And I want to describe what I felt reading them in sequence, rather than experiencing them as they'd arrived, because the sequence itself told a story my parents hadn't intended to tell. The progression was so clean it was almost clinical. Confusion for the first 9 minutes. Irritation for the next 11. Genuine alarm once my father's medication came up for roughly 20 minutes after that. And then, starting around 2 in the afternoon and continuing through the rest of the reception, a sustained, escalating anger that had nothing further to do with confusion about a banking error and everything to do with the specific, dawning recognition that the money was actually gone, permanently, and that no amount of calling was going to change that. I made coffee using the hotel room's small machine, and I sat with David and I called my mother back. I want to explain why I called rather than texted, because I think it matters. I wanted to hear her voice, not because I expected an apology, but because I wanted to know, directly, what story she had decided to tell herself about what had happened, since I already understood, by that point, that my parents had spent 6 years being considerably more comfortable with carefully managed stories than with direct, uncomfortable truths. She picked up on the first ring. Emma? Her voice had the specific, raw quality of someone who hadn't slept much. Thank God. What happened? The transfer just stopped. There was no warning. Your father's been a wreck. I canceled it, I said. Yesterday. In the hallway. Before the ceremony. Right after you told me not to bother you. There was a pause on her end. The specific pause of someone recalibrating a story they'd already constructed in advance for this exact conversation. Emma, I was overwhelmed. Your father wasn't feeling well. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. You said, don't bother us, I said, on the day of my wedding, about whether you were coming. We've had a lot going on, she said. You don't understand the pressure we've been under. I want to describe what happened in me hearing that sentence because I think it's the moment I finally, completely stopped absorbing. For 6 years, "You don't understand the pressure we've been under" had been a sentence that worked on me, that produced guilt, that produced the specific, reflexive softening of someone who has been trained to believe that questioning a parent's hardship is itself a kind of cruelty. It did not work on me that morning because I had spent a month with a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet did not contain any pressure that $200,000 in retirement payout and a Caribbean cruise could not have comfortably absorbed. "I know about the retirement package," I said. "I know about the cruise. I know about the kitchen renovation. I know Dad hasn't been job hunting in years." The silence that followed was different from the previous pause. It was longer, and it had the specific quality of a person realizing, all at once, that the careful architecture they'd maintained for 6 years had just been seen, completely, from the outside. "Who told you that?" she said finally, and I noted, with the same cold precision I bring to reviewing a client's misstated financials, that her first response wasn't denial. It was an attempt to identify the leak, as though the actual issue was that the information had reached me, rather than the fact that the information was true. "It doesn't matter who told me," I said. "What matters is that for 6 years, I sent you $2,000 a month because I believed you needed it to survive, and the entire time, you had 3 times what I was sending coming in from other sources, and you spent it on things that had nothing to do with survival, and you let me believe otherwise." "We were going to tell you eventually," she said. "We just didn't want you to worry." I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I think it's worth examining honestly. The same way the parentified child research I'd come across weeks earlier had helped me examine my own role in this family. There's a specific term used in research on financial abuse within families for the rationalization my mother offered in that moment, what's sometimes described as protective deception, the specific justification deployed by someone who has misled a family member financially, framing the deception not as exploitation, but as an act of care, a way of sparing the other person an unnecessary burden. The framing is almost always sincere, in the sense that the person offering it has usually convinced themselves it's true. It is also, almost always, functionally indistinguishable from simple, sustained dishonesty for personal benefit. "You didn't want me to worry," I repeated. "So instead, for 6 years, I worried constantly. I budgeted around it. I delayed buying a house because I was carrying an extra $2,000 a month I thought was keeping you from losing yours. I felt guilty every single time I bought something for myself because I thought you were struggling to afford groceries." "That's not fair, Emma," she said, and her voice had shifted now into something sharper. "We're your parents. We raised you. You make it sound like we took something from you." "You did take something from me," I said. "You took 6 years of money I gave you under false pretenses, and then, on the one day I asked you to simply be present, you told me not to bother you." There was a long pause, and when my mother spoke again, her voice had changed once more. Not softer, not more conciliatory, but harder. The specific defensive hardness of someone who has decided that the best available move is to reframe the entire conversation as an attack she's now entitled to defend against. "You've always thought you were better than this family," she said. "Ever since you started making real money, you've looked down on the rest of us. Your father is devastated. Tyler's worried sick. And instead of calling to check on your own family the morning after your wedding, you're interrogating me like I'm a criminal." I want to describe what I felt hearing that because it's the moment I understood, completely, that there was not going to be an apology in this conversation, on this day, possibly ever. That my mother's capacity to absorb what had happened was limited entirely to defending the story that made her the wronged party, regardless of what the actual documented facts showed. "I'm not interrogating you," I said. "I already know everything. I just wanted to hear what you'd say." "And what did I say that satisfies you?" she said, her voice rising. "Nothing," I said, "but I didn't expect it to. I think I just needed to hear it for myself." I told her I needed to go, and I hung up before she could respond, and I sat at that small hotel table with David watching me quietly from the bed, and I felt, more than anything, the specific exhausted relief of someone who has finally said a true thing out loud after holding it silently for far too long. My phone buzzed 40 minutes later with a text from Tyler, the first communication from him since his single message the night before. "Mom and Dad are losing it. They want to come see you today. Can I come too? I think we need to actually talk about this as a family." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I texted back 4 words, the same 4 my mother had used on me the day before, deployed now in the opposite direction, with the opposite intention behind them. "Come, bring the documents." I want to explain what I meant by that because Tyler, reading it, had no idea what documents I was referring to. I wasn't asking him to bring anything specific. I was telling him, in the only language I had left for this family, that the next conversation was not going to be one where stories got managed and feelings got protected at the expense of facts. It was going to be the one where I finally laid every single number on the table, in front of all 3 of them, and let the math speak for itself the way it should have been allowed to, 6 years earlier, before I ever set up a transfer I had never once thought to verify. They arrived at my house at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the day after my wedding, while I was still wearing the loose cotton dress I'd changed into after checking out of the hotel, sitting on my own couch in my own living room, rather than a venue I'd paid for, which felt, for the first time in this entire confrontation, like the correct geography for what was about to happen. I want to describe how they arrived, because the specific dynamics of who walked through my door first told me something before a single word was spoken. My father came first, looking older than I remembered him looking even at the wedding rehearsal 3 days earlier, the specific diminished posture of a man who has spent 24 hours discovering that a comfortable arrangement he'd benefited from for years has come to an abrupt and permanent end. My mother followed close behind him, her face arranged in an expression I recognized immediately as the one she wears when she has decided, in advance, exactly how a difficult conversation is going to go, and is prepared to defend that version regardless of what actually happens in the room. Tyler came last, carrying a manila folder I hadn't asked him to bring, but that I understood, the moment I saw it, contained whatever scattered financial paperwork he'd been able to find on short notice. The specific instinct of someone who has never had to organize a real case for anything in his life, trying, earnestly and somewhat helplessly, to be useful. I had spent the morning preparing. I want to describe what that preparation looked like, because I think it matters for understanding the tone of the conversation that followed. I did not approach this the way I'd approached the phone call with my mother, raw and reactive. I approached it the way I approach a client presentation, because I had learned, across 8 years of finance, that the most effective way to make an indefensible position visible is not through accusation, but through documentation, laid out so clearly and so completely that the person looking at it has nowhere left to retreat to. I had printed everything. The 6 years of transfer records, totaling $144,000, organized by date. My father's pension disclosure, showing the retirement package timeline I'd found through public records, with the lump sum payout date highlighted. The home improvement company's invoice, obtained through a polite phone call, where I'd simply asked, as a family member helping settle an estate question, to confirm a project total. $31,400 for the kitchen renovation, completed in year 4. The cruise line's booking confirmation, which Aunt Carol had unwittingly helped me access by mentioning, in a follow-up conversation, the exact dates so I could find the public sailing record and corresponding price tier. The dealership registration for Tyler's truck. I laid it all out on my coffee table before they arrived, organized in chronological order, the same way I'd organize evidence for any financial review. And when my parents and Tyler sat down across from me in my living room, I didn't start with accusations. I started with a single sheet of paper, the summary page, and I slid it across the table toward my father, the same way I'd slid evidence toward David's mother, months earlier, in a completely different confrontation that had taught me exactly how this kind of conversation should be conducted. "I want to start here," I said, "because I think it's important that we're all looking at the same facts before anyone says anything else." My father picked up the page. I watched him read it, his eyes moving down the timeline. The date of his retirement package, 6 months before I'd even told him I could help. The lump sum payout amount, my own transfer total beneath it. I watched the specific color drain from his face that happens when someone is confronted, undeniably, with a record of their own actions that they cannot argue around. "Where did you get this?" he said quietly. "It's public record," I said. "Most of it. The pension disclosure, the dealership filing, the home improvement company's invoice. I'm a financial analyst, Dad. Finding documentation is what I do for a living. I just never thought to do it for my own family until a month ago." My mother reached for the page, read it over my father's shoulder, and I watched her face do something different from his. Not the same drained shock, but a kind of rapid, visible calculation, the specific expression of someone trying to determine which parts of an exposed story are still salvageable. "This doesn't show everything," she said. "There were medical expenses, property taxes went up. You don't know the whole picture." "Then show me the whole picture," I said, and I want to describe the specific calm I was holding on to in that moment, because it was not the absence of anger. It was the discipline of someone who understood that the moment I let the conversation become emotional, it would stop being about facts and start being, the way every previous conversation in this family had always eventually become, about feelings, whose feelings were hurt, who was being unfair to whom, the specific emotional fog that had let 6 years of deception go unexamined in the first place. "I have bank statements. I have public filings. If there's a more complete picture, I genuinely want to see it, but it needs to be documented, the same way everything on this table is documented, not just a story." My mother didn't have documentation. I want to be honest that some part of me, even at that point, hoped she might. Hoped there was some genuine financial catastrophe I'd missed, some context that would make the math less damning than it appeared. There wasn't. What followed over the next 40 minutes was the specific, uncomfortable process of two people slowly running out of explanations, offering one rationalization after another that each, in turn, collapsed against the documents in front of them. The retirement package wasn't really that much after taxes, except the bank statements showed the deposit intact, the same month the home improvement company began the renovation. The cruise had been a gift from Aunt Carol, except Aunt Carol's own account, which I'd specifically asked her to clarify before this meeting, confirmed my parents had paid for it themselves. The truck for Tyler had been an early inheritance, a phrase that produced, when I asked the obvious follow-up question, a long, uncomfortable silence. An early inheritance of what, exactly, when the money funding it had come from a retirement package my father had specifically told me that same year was the only thing standing between them and losing the house. Tyler, sitting beside our parents with the manila folder he'd never actually opened, grew progressively quieter as the conversation went on, and I watched him absorb, in real time, the same realization I'd had 4 weeks earlier, that the family narrative he'd accepted without question, the one where Dad had struggled for years and Emma had generously helped out, was considerably less generous and considerably more deliberate than he'd understood. "Did you know about any of this?" I asked him directly, partway through, because I wanted it on record, in front of our parents, that I didn't believe he'd been complicit. "No," he said quietly. "I swear, Em, I didn't know Dad retired early. I didn't know about the cruise. I thought—" He stopped, looked at our parents, and I watched something shift in his expression. The specific, dawning anger of someone realizing he'd been kept in the dark, not to protect him, but because the truth would have been inconvenient for the people managing it. "I thought you guys were actually struggling. That's what you told me, too." My father, who had been silent for most of the confrontation, finally spoke, and I want to describe what he said, because it was the only moment in that entire afternoon that felt, to me, like something approaching honesty rather than strategic deflection. "I didn't know how to tell you it had stopped being a real emergency," he said, looking at me directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "At first it was real. I was scared, Emma. I didn't know what we were going to do. And then I got the package, and things got easier, and I told myself I'd tell you once we were stable. And then we got stable, and somehow telling you felt harder, not easier, because it meant admitting I'd let you keep helping when I didn't need it anymore. And every month that passed made the conversation harder to have until I just stopped having it. I'm not proud of that. I want to be honest that this was the closest thing to genuine accountability I received from either of my parents that entire afternoon, and I want to be equally honest that it didn't, on its own, repair anything. Recognizing the mechanism of a deception is not the same as making amends for it, and my father's explanation, however sincere, didn't change the documented total on the table between us, or the 11 phone calls the day before, or the specific words my mother had used in that hallway. My mother, for her part, never offered anything resembling that same admission. What she offered instead, as the conversation wound toward its end, was a final attempt at reframing the entire afternoon. "So, what happens now?" she said. "You've made your point. You've shown us the numbers. What do you actually want, Emma?" I had thought about this question for 4 weeks, since the night I first saw that cruise photo, and I gave her the answer I'd settled on, the same answer I'd give again if I had to. "I want you to understand that what happened wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "It was 6 years of a choice you both made, repeatedly, every single month, to let me believe something that wasn't true. I'm not asking you to pay any of it back. I'm not interested in that. What I'm telling you is that the automatic transfer is gone, permanently, and it's not coming back. And going forward, if you need help with something real, you can ask me directly, honestly, and I'll consider it the way I'd consider helping anyone I love. But I will never again fund a story I haven't verified myself." I want to tell you what happened in the months after that afternoon in my living room, because I think the honest, unglamorous aftermath of a confrontation like this matters more than the confrontation itself, and because I've come to believe that the way a family rebuilds, or doesn't rebuild, after a reckoning like this, says more about who they actually are than any single dramatic conversation can. My father called me 2 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon, and I want to describe that call specifically because it was different from every other interaction across that period. He didn't call to ask for anything. He called to tell me he'd started seeing a financial counselor, on his own initiative, paid for out of his own pension, to work through what he described, with a kind of halting honesty I hadn't heard from him before, as understanding why I let it go on so long after I didn't need to. He told me he wasn't calling to ask me to reconsider the transfer. He told me he understood, finally, that the reconsideration wasn't actually the point. I want to be honest that this call moved me more than I expected it to, not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first time in this entire story that my father had done something difficult without an immediate, transactional reason for doing it. There's research in the broader literature on financial dependency within families on what's sometimes called the maintenance cost of deception, the specific cumulative psychological burden carried by the person sustaining a long-term financial fiction, separate entirely from whatever burden the deception places on the person being deceived. I think my father had been carrying that cost for 3 years without ever naming it, and I think, in his own quiet way, that phone call was the beginning of him finally setting it down. My relationship with my father is not what it was before any of this happened. I want to be clear about that because I don't want to suggest this story ends with some clean, complete reconciliation. But it is, 6 months later, something real in a way it hadn't been for years. We talk, perhaps twice a month, honestly, about ordinary things, and twice now he has asked me directly, plainly, for specific, modest help with specific, real expenses, and both times I have said yes, because both times he showed me the actual bill before he asked. My mother is a different story, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think pretending every relationship in a story like this resolves equally would be its own kind of dishonesty. My mother has never, in the 6 months since that afternoon, offered anything resembling the admission my father made. Our conversations since have been brief, infrequent, and carry a specific, persistent undertone of grievance, as though I am the one who damaged something that needs repairing, rather than the one who discovered the damage that had already been done. We speak perhaps once a month, for 10 or 15 minutes, about logistics rather than anything real, and I have made peace, slowly, with the possibility that this is simply what our relationship is going to be for a while, possibly permanently. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with the specific, hard-won clarity of someone who has finally stopped trying to manage another person's feelings at the expense of her own facts. Tyler and I are closer now than we've been in years, which I genuinely didn't expect. Discovering the actual scale of what our parents had done seemed to do something for him that it had done for me weeks earlier. It gave him permission to stop assuming he understood the full picture of his own family, and to start asking the kind of direct questions he'd never thought to ask before. He paid me back, unprompted, the $1,100 from the security deposit, in 3 installments over 2 months, a gesture I hadn't asked for, and that meant more to me than almost anything else that happened across that entire period, because it was the first time in this family's entire financial history that anyone had treated an obligation as something owed rather than something simply absorbed. I want to tell you about the spreadsheet, because I think it's the detail that best captures where I actually landed, emotionally, on the other side of all of this. I still have it. I update it occasionally, not out of resentment, but out of the same habit that built it in the first place, the specific professional instinct to keep an accurate record rather than relying on memory, which I've come to understand across this entire experience is the single most important lesson buried inside everything that happened to me. I think about the version of myself who set up that transfer 6 years ago, 25 years old, sitting at a kitchen table, responding to her crying father with the words, "I can help." And I don't regret that instinct. I think it came from a genuinely good place, the same place that makes me good at my job and, I'd like to believe, a good partner to David and a good friend to people like Priya, who showed up for me without being asked, the way family is supposed to. What I regret, if I regret anything, is the 6 years I spent never once asking the math to confirm the story. I had the skills to verify it from the very beginning. I am, professionally, someone whose entire job is verification, and I simply never turned that skill toward the people I trusted most, because some part of me had decided, long before I understood I'd decided it, that trusting my family meant never checking the numbers, that checking would itself be a kind of betrayal. I understand now that the opposite was true. The checking wasn't the betrayal. The checking was simply, finally, treating my own resources, my own labor, my own years of careful financial discipline with the same seriousness I'd been taught, professionally, to treat everyone else's. I got married on a Saturday in early autumn, in a garden in Charleston, to a man who held my hand in a hallway and told me the rest was just logistics. My parents' chairs were empty that day, and for a long time afterward, I thought of that empty row as the saddest image from my wedding. I don't think of it that way anymore. I think of it now as the moment a 6-year-old story finally ran out of road, in the one place it could no longer hide behind a phone call, or a vague excuse, or a careful, managed half-truth. An empty row of chairs, in front of 200 witnesses, on the one day a family is supposed to show up no matter what. They didn't show up, and for the first time in 6 years, I finally let that absence mean exactly what it actually meant, instead of finding a kinder story to tell myself about it. That, more than the canceled transfer, more than the spreadsheet, more than the confrontation in my living room, is the actual ending of this story. Not the money. The moment I stopped editing the truth to make it easier for everyone else to live with. I was done living with the easier version, and I have not, in the 6 months since, missed it once.